The morning of June 19th, 1944, 60 miles west of Saipan, Flight Petty Officer First Class Sakio Tsuboi adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon from his Zero fighter. Below him, 46 other aircraft from Carrier Division 2 formed up in loose formation, their engines straining at 18,000 feet. This was it, the decisive battle, Operation Ago. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had preserved, everything they had trained for through the long months since Rabaul, would be decided in the next 2 hours. Tsuboi had exactly 94 days of flight training, 3 months and 4 days. He knew this because he counted every one of them at the Omura Air Group in Kyushu, where instructors pushed him through basics that should have taken a year. Takeoffs and landings, formation flying, gun camera exercises against targets that never shot back, then straight to a fleet carrier, assigned to escort dive bombers against the most powerful naval force ever assembled. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans were somewhere ahead. Task Force 58, 15 carriers, 900 aircraft. Tsuboi had never seen an American fighter except in recognition silhouettes. He knew the shapes, the F4F Wildcat with its stubby wings, the newer F6F Hellcat, larger, more powerful, reportedly faster than anything Japan could field. But silhouettes were not the same as combat, and combat was not the same as the carefully orchestrated training missions where everyone returned to base and instructors pointed out mistakes over tea. The radio crackled, formation commander's voice tense and clipped, enemy fighters inbound. Vectors from the radar picket ships put them 50 miles out and closing fast. Tsuboi's hands tightened on the control stick. This was what he had trained for. What every hour in the cockpit, every formation drill, every night study session had been preparing him to face. The Americans were coming to meet them, exactly as doctrine predicted. And when they engaged, Japanese skill and spirit would prevail. It always had. What Tsuboi could not know, what no amount of training or spirit could prepare him for, was that he was about to encounter odds that no Japanese pilot in the Pacific War had ever faced. Odds that would make the previous year's battles look balanced by comparison. Odds that would destroy not just his formation, but the entire operational capability of Japanese naval aviation in a single afternoon. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese would call it the end. 9 months earlier, October 1943, Commander Matomi Ugaki wrote in his diary aboard the battleship Yamato. His assessment of Imperial Navy aviation was brutally honest for a man in his position. After reviewing training reports from the reconstructed carrier air groups, he noted that replacement pilots showed promising spirit but lacked the fundamental skills that had made the Pearl Harbor strike force so devastating. The numbers told a story that optimism could not disguise. In December 1941, the average Japanese naval aviator launching from carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku had accumulated over 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience over China, where they had refined their skills against opponents flying inferior equipment. They knew their aircraft intimately. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, formation tactics. They could land on a carrier deck in rough seas at night, a skill that required hundreds of practice repetitions to master. The pilots replacing them in 1944 were different. The Japanese training pipeline, robust in 1941 when the nation had surplus fuel and experienced instructors, had collapsed under the weight of attrition. Coral Sea in May 1942 cost 74 trained aircrew. Midway 1 month later claimed 110. But those singular battles, sharp blows that could be absorbed and replaced. The Solomon Islands campaign from August 1942 through November 1943 was different. It was a grinding, continuous meat grinder that consumed pilots faster than training programs could produce replacements. Japanese carriers had sent their aircraft ashore to Rabaul and Bougainville to contest American advances through the island chain. The decision made tactical sense. Land bases provided better logistics, more sorties per day, and eliminated the vulnerability of keeping carriers in contested waters. But it also meant that when pilots were shot down, they died. There was no carrier to ditch near, no destroyer picking up survivors from the ocean. When a Zero went down over Guadalcanal or New Georgia, the pilot was simply gone. And with each loss went not just a man, but hundreds of hours of irreplaceable experience. The Navy's pilot training infrastructure simply could not keep pace. By mid-1944, fuel shortages forced drastic cuts to flight training programs. Sakio Tsuboi's 94 days at Omura represented the new normal. Some pilots in Carrier Division 3, operating from light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, had received as little as 60 days of instruction. They could fly their aircraft, they could take off and land on a carrier deck, though not reliably in rough weather. But the instinctive understanding of air combat that came only from hundreds of hours of practice, that sense of where your opponent would be in 3 seconds based on his current energy state and angle of bank, that was simply absent. The contrast with American training was stark and quantifiable. By 1944, every U.S. Navy pilot arriving in the combat zone had completed a minimum of 2 years of instruction. The typical Hellcat pilot graduating from advanced carrier training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi or Jacksonville had logged over 300 hours before ever seeing a Japanese aircraft. They practiced carrier landings until the procedure became automatic. They flew gunnery exercises that consumed thousands of rounds of ammunition. They learned tactics from instructors who had survived combat in the Solomons and could teach the specific techniques that worked against Japanese fighters. More importantly, American pilots had time to make mistakes in training where errors were survivable. They could misjudge an approach and go around for another attempt. They could miss during gunnery practice and try again. They could learn from experienced squadron mates during lengthy workup periods before deploying. This luxury of time, funded by America's vast resources and secure training infrastructure, created pilots who entered combat with skills that Japanese aviators once possessed but could no longer maintain. The industrial and logistical factors compounding Japan's pilot quality problems would have seemed abstract to Sakio Tsuboi on the morning of June 19th, but they were about to become immediately relevant. The fuel shortage that had curtailed his training also affected the fleet's operational planning in ways that placed enormous strain on pilots. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the 1st Mobile Fleet, had been forced to base his carriers at Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, specifically because the location sat near Japanese-controlled oil fields in Borneo. American submarines had devastated Japan's tanker fleet. The few tankers that survived operated under constant threat, making the long voyage from the Dutch East Indies to Japan a gauntlet that grew more dangerous monthly. Rather than risk fleet tankers in contested waters, Ozawa kept his carriers close to the source of fuel. This decision saved oil but created a different problem. Tawi-Tawi sat almost exactly on the equator. At that latitude, there were effectively no prevailing winds. Wind over the deck was critical for carrier flight and operations. Aircraft needed wind speed to generate lift during takeoff, especially heavily loaded fighters and bombers carrying external fuel tanks and weapons. Without natural wind, carriers had to achieve it through speed, accelerating to 30 knots while aircraft launched. But this burned fuel at prodigious rates and limited the time carriers could maintain flying operations. The result was that Japanese pilots based at Tawi-Tawi received minimal flight training during the months before Operation Ago. They could not conduct the continuous practice launches and recoveries that built the muscle memory essential for carrier operations. When they did fly, exercises were brief and focused on basic procedures rather than advanced combat tactics. The pilots who would face Task Force 58 on June 19th had spent more time performing maintenance on their aircraft than flying them. American pilots, meanwhile, trained continuously. Task Force 58 had spent the weeks before the Marianas operation conducting strikes against Japanese installations across the Central Pacific. Every mission provided practical experience. Pilots learned to navigate over open ocean, to coordinate large formations, to identify targets and execute attack runs. They practiced defensive tactics against Japanese fighters, learning which maneuvers worked and which created vulnerabilities. By June 19, 1944, even the newest American pilots had combat experience. The Japanese, by contrast, were about to enter their first major engagement. The technological disparity between the aircraft themselves added another layer to Japanese disadvantages. The Mitsubishi A6M0, legendary in 1941 for its range and maneuverability, had become obsolete by 1944. The basic design dated to 1939. Successive models had added features, heavier guns, improved engines, but the fundamental airframe remained unchanged, and that airframe had been designed around a philosophy that prioritized range and agility over survivability. To achieve its remarkable combat radius of over 900 miles, the Zero sacrificed everything that protected pilots. No armor plating behind the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks, lightweight aluminum construction that crumpled under stress. These design choices made sense in 1941 when Japanese pilots were well trained enough to avoid being hit. But against the overwhelming firepower and numbers of American fighters in 1944, they became fatal liabilities. A single burst from a Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns could destroy a Zero. The bullets, each weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at over 2,700 feet per second, would punch through the Zero's thin aluminum skin without slowing. If they hit the fuel tanks, which were not self-sealing, gasoline would pour out and ignite. Zeros burned easily. Pilots called them flying cigarette lighters. American pilots learned quickly that any solid hit on a Zero's fuel system meant certain destruction. The Grumman F6F Hellcat represented a completely different design philosophy. Powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, it generated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, 600 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakio engine. This power translated into speed. The Hellcat could exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight, making it nearly 70 miles per hour faster than the Zero. More importantly, it could sustain high speeds in climbs and dives where the Zero's lighter engine struggled. The Hellcat was also brutally tough. Grumman engineers had studied combat damage reports from Wildcat operations and designed the Hellcat to absorb punishment. Armor plating protected the pilot from behind and below. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even if bullets punctured them, they would seal automatically, preventing catastrophic fuel loss and fire. The airframe itself was overbuilt, designed to handle stress loads that would tear a Zero apart. Hellcats regularly returned to carriers with dozens of bullet holes, damage that would have destroyed Japanese fighters, and flew again the next day. Armament favored the Americans dramatically. The Hellcat carried 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 2,400 total rounds of ammunition. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute. When a Hellcat pilot pressed his trigger, he unleashed 80 rounds per second, nearly 5,000 rounds per minute from all 6 guns combined. The cone of fire from those 6 guns converged at 400 yards, creating a lethal volume of space where anything caught would be shredded. The Zero's armament was lighter and less reliable. Early models carried 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and 2 20mm cannons in the wings. The cannons were powerful when they hit, but their slow rate of fire, roughly 60 rounds per minute per gun, and limited ammunition capacity of just 60 rounds per cannon, meant that pilots had to be extremely conservative. The nose-mounted machine guns were ineffective against American fighters with armor protection. Zero pilots needed precise deflection shots with their cannons to achieve kills, and they rarely had time for more than one burst before having to break away or risk running out of ammunition. The aircraft performance gap was measurable and documented. In testing conducted at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland during late 1943, American engineers evaluated a captured Zero against the Hellcat. The tests revealed specific advantages that tactical officers immediately incorporated into pilot training. At low altitude, below 10,000 feet, the Hellcat was faster by 65 miles per hour. At medium altitudes, 15 to 20,000 feet, where most combat occurred, the advantage was 55 miles per hour. The Zero could only match the Hellcat's speed above 25,000 feet, an altitude that tactical considerations rarely permitted. Climb rate told a similar story. From sea level to 10,000 feet, The Hellcat required 2 minutes and 50 seconds. The Zero needed 3 minutes and 20 seconds. That 30-second difference meant that in any engagement where both aircraft started from the same altitude, the Hellcat could climb faster and maintain energy advantage. American tactical doctrine exploited this ruthlessly. Dive performance created the most dramatic gap. The Hellcat could safely exceed 450 miles per hour in a vertical dive, maintaining full control authority throughout. The Zero's lightweight construction meant that at speeds above 350 miles per hour, control surfaces would stiffen dangerously, making the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Several Japanese pilots had torn their wings off attempting to follow diving American fighters. This single limitation essentially removed the vertical dimension from Japanese tactical options. If a Zero tried to follow a diving Hellcat, structural failure was probable. If it did not follow, the American escaped. American pilots learned these advantages during training and exploited them ruthlessly in combat. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Hellcat operations emphasized energy management and vertical maneuvers, refusing to engage in horizontal turning fights where the Zero's superior maneuverability provided advantages. Hellcat pilots were taught to maintain altitude advantage, diving to attack with overwhelming speed, firing a burst, then using their excess speed to climb back to altitude where Zeros could not follow effectively. This boom and zoom doctrine, refined through months of combat experience in the Solomons and Central Pacific, transformed American fighter operations from desperate defensive battles to systematic hunting. By June 1944, it had become standard operating procedure across Task Force 58. Every pilot knew the basics. Start high, dive fast, shoot once, climb away, never turn with a Zero, never slow down in a Zero's firing envelope, use speed and altitude to dictate engagement terms. The Japanese, lacking comparable performance, could not counter these tactics effectively. The training disparity, the aircraft performance gap, the different design philosophies, all of these factors had been developing for months, creating a situation where Japanese naval aviation was qualitatively inferior in nearly every measurable category. But the quantitative disparity was equally dramatic and perhaps even more decisive. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 from his flagship USS Lexington. His force represented the largest concentration of naval aviation power ever assembled. 15 aircraft carriers formed the core. 7 Essex-class fleet carriers. Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Lexington, Enterprise, and Essex. 8 Independence-class light carriers. Monterey, Cabot, Bataan, Belleau Wood, Princeton, San Jacinto, Cowpens, and Langley. Together they embarked 891 aircraft, 463 fighters, mostly Hellcats with some Corsairs, 217 dive bombers, 193 torpedo bombers, plus float planes and reconnaissance aircraft. The carrier force was screened by 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. Many of these ships carried their own aircraft, scout float planes that extended the task force's search radius. The total count approached 1,000 aircraft available to Mitcher, but raw numbers told only part of the story. These aircraft were maintained by well-supplied repair crews, with spare parts for everything. They were fueled with high-octane avgas delivered by efficient logistics ships. They were armed with ammunition that had traveled 6,000 miles across the Pacific in secure supply lines that Japanese submarines could not effectively threaten. Vice Admiral Ozawa's first mobile fleet was smaller by nearly every measure. 9 carriers formed his strike force. 5 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Hio. 4 light carriers, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. These ships embarked 430 aircraft, less than half Mitcher's strength. Additionally, Japanese land-based air forces in the Marianas were supposed to provide another 500 aircraft, but American carrier strikes on June 11th and 12th had devastated those bases. When Ozawa sortied for battle, he believed he had land-based support. In reality, those forces had been largely destroyed, and the surviving aircraft were so disorganized they would contribute little to the coming battle. Ozawa's fleet was also hindered by logistics problems that went beyond simple numbers. The carriers burned fuel at rates that required careful management. The escort screen of battleships and cruisers was powerful but positioned forward of the carriers in an attempt to provide anti-aircraft protection. This deployment meant that attacking American aircraft would have to penetrate that screen, but it also meant the carriers themselves were harder to coordinate with the screen for mutual support. Most critically, Japanese reconnaissance was inadequate. Ozawa had scout aircraft, but they lacked radar and relied on visual searches that were limited by weather and visibility. American radar could detect incoming aircraft formations at over 100 miles, providing ample warning to launch fighters and position defenses. Japanese search aircraft might spot American carriers, or they might miss them entirely depending on luck and weather. This information disparity meant that American commanders always knew where Japanese forces were located, while Ozawa operated with incomplete and often inaccurate intelligence. The morning of June 19th opened with both fleets maneuvering for position. American submarines had detected Ozawa's fleet days earlier, trailing it and reporting position updates that gave Micha continuous intelligence. Radar-equipped scout aircraft supplemented submarine reports, creating a comprehensive picture of Japanese movements. Ozawa, by contrast, was effectively blind. His scouts searched to the limit of their range but found nothing. The Americans were there, somewhere east of Saipan, but exactly where remained unknown. At 0800 hours, Ozawa launched his first strike. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 69 aircraft from Carrier Division 3, operating with the van force under Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi. The formation included fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, a mixed raid intended to overwhelm American defenses through numbers and diversity of attack angles. What happened next would establish the pattern for the entire day and would earn the battle its infamous nickname. American radar detected the incoming formation at 0959, while the Japanese aircraft were still 140 miles away from Task Force 58. The radar operators aboard picket destroyers identified the formation as large, approximately 60-plus contacts, and forwarded vectors to Micha's flagship. The task force had been expecting this attack. Fighter directors aboard the carriers had been tracking submarine reports and land-based reconnaissance all morning. They knew Japanese carriers had launched aircraft. The only question was when those aircraft would arrive. The answer triggered organized chaos across 15 carrier flight decks. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers were quickly launched to orbit clear of the task force, freeing deck space for fighters. Every available Hellcat was armed, fueled, and positioned for launch. Within minutes, over 200 Hellcats were airborne, climbing to intercept positions. Fighter directors used radar data to vector the Hellcats toward optimal intercept points, positioning them at varying altitudes from 15,000 to 25,000 feet. This was the moment where American technological and training advantages crystallized into overwhelming tactical superiority. The Hellcat pilots climbing to intercept knew exactly where the enemy was, how many aircraft were inbound, their altitude, speed, and direction. The Japanese pilots had no idea American fighters were positioning above and ahead of them until visual contact, which would come at less than 10 miles range. By then, the Americans held every advantage: altitude, speed, position, and numbers. The Japanese formation, following doctrine developed for combat against less capable Wildcats in 1942, climbed to 20,000 feet and orbited to reform after launch. This procedure, sensible when facing a defensive-minded opponent, became fatal against Hellcats with radar guidance and overwhelming numbers. Every minute the Japanese spent orbiting gave American fighters more time to position. Every 1,000 feet they climbed put them closer to American fighters already waiting above. At 65 miles from Task Force 58, Hellcat formations rolled into attack. The Japanese scouts spotted them instantly, the sky suddenly full of dark blue shapes diving out of the sun. There was no time for fancy maneuvering. The Americans came straight down at over 400 miles per hour, far too fast for Zeros to evade. Each Hellcat picked a target, closed to 400 yards, fired a 2-second burst, and dove through the formation before Japanese pilots could react. Flight Petty Officer Sakio Tsuboi watched the Hellcat formation attack with a detachment that felt like watching someone else's death. His section leader's Zero simply exploded, a fireball that left no wreckage large enough to identify. The Hellcat that killed him was already 2,000 feet below, climbing away before Tsuboi could even line up a shot. More Hellcats followed, each one diving through the formation, each one destroying another aircraft. The Japanese formation, carefully organized during launch, disintegrated in under 3 minutes. Individual pilots broke formation, some trying to dive away, others attempting to climb toward the attackers. Neither worked. Zeros that dove found Hellcats following them, matching their dive speed and firing at leisure. Zeros that climbed could not match American climb rates and became easy targets for Hellcats already positioned above. The engagement became less a dogfight than an execution. American pilots later described it as too easy, almost unsporting. One Hellcat pilot from USS Lexington reported shooting down 4 Zeros in 7 minutes without receiving a single hit in return. The statistics from this first raid were staggering and set the template for the rest of the day. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that launched, 42 were shot down before reaching Task Force 58. Most were destroyed by Hellcats during the initial interception, but American ships' anti-aircraft fire claimed several more as scattered survivors attempted individual attacks. The remaining aircraft, fewer than 25, turned back toward their carriers without achieving any hits on American ships. American losses in this engagement totaled 1 Hellcat shot down with the pilot recovered. This 42-to-1 kill ratio was unprecedented in Pacific War naval aviation. Previous battles had seen more balanced exchanges. Coral Sea produced roughly equal losses on both sides. Midway favored Americans, but at significant cost. Even in the Solomons, where Americans gradually gained superiority, typical engagements saw ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. 42-to-1 suggested something fundamentally different. This was not combat between near-peer opponents. This was systematic annihilation. Ozawa remained unaware of the disaster. Communication from the strike force was chaotic. Some pilots reported engaging American carriers. Others reported heavy fighter opposition. None accurately communicated the scale of losses. Japanese doctrine emphasized radio silence except for critical reports, and pilots under attack rarely had time to send detailed assessments before being shot down. Ozawa's staff plotted expected strike results based on optimistic assumptions and prepared a second wave. The second raid launched at 0956, 109 aircraft from Carrier Divisions 1 and 2. This was Ozawa's main striking power, a massive formation including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft, supported by the most experienced pilots in the fleet. If any Japanese formation on June 19th had the training and capability to reach American carriers and inflict damage, this was it. American radar detected the formation at 116 miles range. Fighter directors aboard the task force carriers vectored intercepting Hellcats with precision that reflected months of radar-directed combat experience. Over 150 Hellcats climbed to meet the Japanese formation, stacking themselves at multiple altitudes from 18,000 to 28,000 feet. The Japanese, climbing through 22,000 feet, found themselves bracketed above and below by aircraft they could not effectively engage due to altitude and speed disadvantages. The slaughter began 60 miles from Task Force 58 and continued for the next 30 minutes as Japanese aircraft pressed eastward toward their target. Hellcats dove in groups of 4 or 6, executing coordinated attacks that gave Japanese pilots no opportunity to maneuver defensively. By the time the formation reached 40 miles from American carriers, it had lost over half its aircraft. 70 planes shot down, bodies and wreckage scattered across 50 miles of ocean. The survivors pressed forward with determination that bordered on suicidal. These were the best pilots Ozawa had, men with 6 months training instead of 3, men who understood that turning back meant failure and that pushing forward might somehow succeed. They reached the outer defensive screen, Vice Admiral Willis Lee's battle line of battleships and cruisers positioned 15 miles ahead of the carriers specifically to intercept any aircraft that penetrated the fighter screen. What happened next demonstrated why Japanese pilots called American anti-aircraft fire a steel curtain. Lee's battleships, particularly the newer vessels like Indiana, Alabama, and Iowa, mounted dozens of 5-inch guns and hundreds of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. When the Japanese aircraft came within range, every ship in the battle line opened fire simultaneously, the sky filled with tracer rounds and flak bursts. The new proximity-fused shells, a technology the Japanese had no counter for, exploded when they sensed an aircraft nearby, creating lethal fragmentation patterns that did not require direct hits. Japanese dive bombers attempting to push through this defensive belt were blown apart mid-attack. Torpedo bombers flying low to launch their weapons were caught by crossfire from multiple ships. The few aircraft that survived to reach attack positions found themselves facing yet another layer of defense, the carrier's own anti-aircraft guns and the close-in CAP, Combat Air Patrol, of Hellcats that had been held back specifically to defend the flat tops from any leakers. Out of 109 aircraft in the second raid, 97 were destroyed. 8 managed to return to their carriers. 4 others, damaged beyond hope of reaching friendly territory, ditched near American destroyers where the crews were captured. American losses totaled 2 Hellcats shot down with both pilots recovered. 1 battleship, South Dakota, took a single bomb hit that killed 27 men but did not impair her combat capability. The third raid launched shortly after noon, 47 aircraft from Carrier Division 2. This formation suffered navigation errors that dispersed it across a 100-mile front. Some aircraft flew toward Guam, hoping to refuel at Japanese bases there, only to encounter American fighters patrolling over the island. Others found Task Force 58 but arrived piecemeal, in groups of 3 or 4, making them easy prey for the scores of Hellcats orbiting above the fleet. 15 aircraft were shot down. The rest fled back toward their carriers or attempted to land on Guam, where they were strafed on the ground by American fighters that followed them down. The fourth and final raid launched between 1100 and 1130 hours, 82 aircraft from Carrier Divisions 1 and 2. This formation was given incorrect position information for Task Force 58 and flew search patterns trying to locate the American carriers. By the time they found the fleet, fuel was critically low, forcing them to either attack immediately or turn back. 49 aircraft attempted attacks. 30 were shot down by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The 19 survivors that returned to the fleet did so with empty fuel tanks, several ditching alongside their carriers when their engines quit during landing approaches. By 1600 hours, June 19th, the Battle of the Philippine Seas air combat phase was effectively over. Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier air groups had launched approximately 373 aircraft in 4 major raids. Of those, 315 were destroyed. American losses totaled 23 aircraft shot down in combat, most falling to anti-aircraft fire from Japanese ships or landing accidents. Not one American carrier was damaged by Japanese aircraft. The kill ratio, calculated from official action reports compiled in the weeks following the battle, stood at approximately 19-1. 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American aircraft lost to enemy action. This ratio exceeded anything previously recorded in military aviation history. The battle earned its nickname from a remark made during debriefing aboard USS Lexington. A pilot, describing the day's combat, compared it to turkey shoots back home where domesticated birds were released for hunters to target. The comparison stuck. The Great Mariana's turkey shoot, but for the Japanese pilots who survived, men like Sakio Tsuboi who managed to return to his carrier after watching his entire section get shot down, the experience was something beyond a simple defeat. It was a revelation that everything they had been taught, everything they believed about Japanese aviation superiority, was obsolete. The Americans did not just have better aircraft, they had better tactics, better technology, better training, better logistics, better everything. The gap was not narrow enough to overcome through courage or skill. It was absolute. Tsuboi landed aboard Junyo at 17:42 hours with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. His aircraft had taken 3 hits from Hellcat fire, holes in the wing fabric that had been patched with canvas by the deck crew. During debriefing, he told the intelligence officer that American fighter interception had been perfect, that they knew exactly where Japanese formations were before visual contact, that they attacked with numerical superiority at every engagement. The intelligence officer noted these observations but seemed unsurprised. Similar reports were coming in from every surviving pilot. What Tsuboi and his fellow pilots could not know was that the battle had not ended. While Japanese aircrew struggled back to their carriers throughout the afternoon, American submarines had been stalking Ozawa's fleet, waiting for opportunities that carrier air operations provided. At 0909 hours, USS Albacore had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. 1 torpedo struck home, hitting the carrier's starboard side forward. The damage appeared manageable. Taiho was the newest and best protected Japanese carrier, with an armored flight deck and anti-torpedo bulges. The hit flooded one fire room but did not immediately threaten the ship. What doomed Taiho was inexperience compounding disaster. The carrier had been fueled with unrefined Borneo crude oil because Japan's refining capacity could no longer supply the fleet with processed fuel. This crude oil was volatile and produced dangerous fumes. When the torpedo hit ruptured fuel tanks, those fumes began spreading through the ship's lower decks. An inexperienced damage control officer, attempting to ventilate the spaces, opened the ship's ventilation system. Instead of removing the fumes, this spread them throughout the carrier. At 15:32 hours, nearly 7 hours after the torpedo hit, a spark from unknown origin ignited the fumes. The resulting explosion blew out both sides of Taiho's hangar deck, warped the armored flight deck upward, and tore holes in the ship's bottom. Ozawa and his staff evacuated to a destroyer, then transferred to the cruiser Haguro to re-establish command. Taiho sank at 16:28 hours. 1,660 men died with her, including many veteran aircrew who had survived the day's combat only to perish when their ship exploded. USS Kavala had better immediate results. At 12:20 hours, she fired 4 torpedoes at carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and the Santa Cruz battles. 3 torpedoes hit, devastating the carrier. Shokaku's avgas storage and bomb magazines exploded in a massive fireball visible for miles. The carrier sank at 1500 hours, taking 1,263 men with her, including nearly all of her surviving aircrew who had just landed from the day's strikes. In 6 hours, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers, 315 aircraft, and over 2,000 men. His remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hiyo, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, embarked fewer than 100 operational aircraft total. Many pilots who had survived combat were dead aboard Taiho and Shokaku. Others had ditched due to fuel exhaustion and not been recovered. The first mobile fleet still existed as a collection of ships, but as an offensive striking force, it was finished. Admiral Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, made the controversial decision not to pursue Ozawa's retreating force that evening. His primary mission was protecting the Saipan landings, and he worried that a night engagement might scatter his task groups and leave the invasion force vulnerable if additional Japanese forces approached from other directions. This conservative approach drew criticism from aggressive subordinates like Admiral Micha, who believed the entire Japanese fleet could have been destroyed. But Spruance's decision reflected his understanding that the strategic objective, securing the Marianas, was more important than sinking enemy ships. June 20th brought the pursuit phase. American search aircraft located Ozawa's fleet at 15:40 hours, approximately 275 miles west of Task Force 58. This was extreme range for American aircraft, pushing them to their operational limits. Micha made the decision to launch strikes anyway, knowing that many aircraft would not have enough fuel to return. At 16:20 hours, 216 aircraft launched from American carriers, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, heading west into the setting sun. The strike found Ozawa's fleet at 18:40 hours. Light was failing, fuel was critically low, But the Americans pressed their attacks with determination born from understanding this might be their only chance to destroy the remaining Japanese carriers. Carrier Hyo took 2 torpedo hits and went down quickly. Zuikaku and Chiyoda were damaged. A fleet oiler was sunk. Several other ships took hits. Then the Americans turned for home, with darkness falling and fuel gauges showing empty. The return flight became an ordeal that tested American logistics and leadership. Pilots flying back toward their carriers in complete darkness knew many would run out of fuel before reaching safety. Some did, ditching in the ocean and hoping for rescue. Others made it to the task force only to discover they could not see the carriers to land. Admiral Mitcher made a decision that violated every blackout procedure in the book. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on its lights. Destroyers illuminated themselves. Cruisers fired star shells into the sky. Most dramatically, carriers turned on their flight deck lights, enormous bright spots visible for 30 miles that told every Japanese submarine within range exactly where American carriers were located. Mitcher accepted the risk because saving his aircrew mattered more than theoretical submarine threats. The bet paid off. Most pilots found the task force and landed safely, though 80 aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents. Destroyers and cruisers spent the night rescuing pilots from the ocean. By dawn, most were recovered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with Ozawa's fleet retreating west toward Okinawa, no longer capable of offensive operations. American carriers returned to supporting the Saipan landings. The strategic result was decisive and permanent. Japan had committed its rebuilt carrier force to battle and had it effectively destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy would sortie carriers one more time, in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf, where they served as decoys with almost no aircraft embarked. As an offensive force, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist after June 20, 1944. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots who survived was profound and well documented in post-war interviews. They understood that they had faced odds no amount of training or courage could overcome. American technological superiority, quantitative advantage, and superior tactics had combined to create a situation where Japanese defeat was essentially predetermined. The typical pilot's narrative emphasized helplessness rather than individual failure. They described American fighters that seemed to know where Japanese formations were before visual contact, aircraft that could dive away from danger faster than Zeros could follow, anti-aircraft fire that hit with impossible accuracy, and numbers that meant that even when Japanese pilots achieved kills, there were always more Americans to take their place. Sakio Tsuboi survived June 19th and continued flying until August 1945, when Japan surrendered. In post-war accounts preserved by the Japanese Defense Agency, he described the Philippine Sea battle as the moment he understood Japan could not win the war. The Americans did not simply have more resources. They had built a system of war production, training, logistics, and tactics that Japan could not match. Every category in which quality or quantity mattered favored the Americans, and that advantage was growing, not shrinking. The mathematics supported Tsuboi's assessment. In June 1944, American shipyards were launching one fleet carrier every 3 months and one light carrier every 6 weeks. Aircraft production exceeded 5,000 fighters per month. Pilot training programs graduated over 1,000 new aviators monthly, each with over 300 hours of flight time. Japan could not replace the 300 aircraft lost on June 19th in less than 2 months. The pilots lost would take a year to replace if fuel was available for training, which it was not. The long-term strategic consequences of the Philippine Sea battle rippled through the remainder of the Pacific War. With Japanese naval aviation eliminated as a threat, American carrier task forces operated with near impunity. They struck Japanese installations across the Pacific with minimal opposition. The conquest of the Marianas proceeded ahead of schedule. B-29 superfortresses began flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in November 1944, bringing Tokyo itself within range of strategic bombing. The chain of cause and effect that led from the Philippine Sea to Hiroshima was direct and quantifiable. Japanese military leaders understood what the battle meant. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government fell within days as political leaders recognized that defeat was now inevitable. The question shifted from whether Japan could win to how Japan could end the war with some honor intact. That question would take 14 more months and hundreds of thousands more deaths to answer. But the strategic turning point occurred on June 19th, 1944, when Japanese pilots intercepted American Hellcats and discovered they faced 19-1 odds. The legacy of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot extended beyond immediate tactical results. It established patterns that defined the rest of the Pacific Air War. American pilots, confident in their training and equipment, pressed attacks aggressively. Japanese pilots, aware of their qualitative and quantitative disadvantages, became increasingly defensive and risk-averse. This psychological shift affected every subsequent engagement. Even when Japanese pilots had opportunities to attack American forces, they hesitated, remembering what happened when they committed to combat against prepared American defenses. The battle also validated specific technological investments that American military planners had made years earlier. Radar-directed fighter interception, proven at the Philippine Sea, became standard practice. The proximity-fused anti-aircraft shell, so effective against Japanese aircraft, was produced in enormous quantities for Pacific Fleet operations. The Hellcat fighter, purpose-built to defeat the Zero, proved its worth decisively and remained the Navy's primary fighter through war's end. Even minor innovations like fighter director, officer training, and coordinated air defense procedures were vindicated by the battle's results. For military historians analyzing the battle decades later, the Philippine Sea became a case study in how multiple factors combine to produce decisive results. No single element caused Japan's defeat on June 19th. The outcome resulted from American advantages in pilot training intersecting with aircraft performance superiority, amplified by radar technology, supported by overwhelming numerical strength, and executed through superior tactics refined over months of combat. Japanese disadvantages in each category compounded rather than cancelled, creating a situation where defeat was multiplicative rather than additive. The human cost deserves emphasis. Over 3,000 Japanese naval personnel died on June 19th and 20th, most of them young men like Sakio Tsuboi, who had trained briefly and fought bravely against impossible odds. They were not responsible for the strategic decisions that led Japan into war against an opponent with 10 times its industrial capacity. They were not responsible for the tactical doctrines that proved obsolete against American technology. They simply flew the missions assigned, faced the enemy, and died when their obsolete aircraft and inadequate training proved insufficient. American casualties were remarkably light by comparison. Fewer than 100 men lost over 2 days of combat. This disparity in losses created psychological effects that persisted beyond the battle itself. Japanese military culture emphasized honor in defeat and fighting to the death rather than surrendering. But the Philippine Sea battle challenged these values by demonstrating that sometimes fighting to the death meant simply dying without inflicting meaningful damage on the enemy. The question of what honor meant in unwinnable tactical situations would haunt Japanese military thinking through the war's final year. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the last time Japan would sortie a powerful carrier force seeking decisive battle. The doctrine that had guided Japanese naval planning since the 1920s, the belief that one climactic engagement would decide the war, died in the waters west of Saipan. What replaced it was grimmer, the recognition that Japan was now fighting only to delay defeat and inflict maximum casualties on American forces advancing toward the home islands. This defensive mindset would produce the kamikaze campaigns, the suicidal banzai charges, and the desperate final resistance that characterized the war's last year. Admiral Ozawa, who commanded the first mobile fleet during the battle, provided his own assessment in post-war interrogations. He stated that American radio intelligence had given them complete knowledge of Japanese plans, that American radar had made fighter interception almost automatic, and that Japanese pilot quality was simply too low to compete. He accepted responsibility for the defeat, but noted that by June 1944, the factors that produced that defeat were beyond any commander's ability to change. Japan had lost the war for air supremacy during the Solomons campaign. The Philippine Sea battle simply made that loss visible and undeniable. The technical lessons learned from the battle influenced post-war aviation development. The radar-directed fighter interception, pioneered at the Philippine Sea, became standard for all naval aviation forces. The Hellcats' design philosophy, trading pure performance for ruggedness and firepower, influenced the next generation of carrier fighters. Even the tactics, maintaining energy advantage through altitude and speed, rather than trying to outmaneuver opponents, became foundational principles taught to fighter pilots for decades after the war ended. For the pilots involved, American and Japanese, the battle remained a defining moment in their lives. American pilots who participated described it decades later, with a mixture of pride in their performance and discomfort at how one-sided it had been. Many noted that the Japanese pilots they faced fought bravely despite impossible odds, that they pressed attacks even when clearly outmatched, and that they deserved respect even in defeat. Japanese survivors like Tsuboi described the battle as educational in the cruelest sense, teaching them through experience that courage and training alone could not overcome technological and numerical inferiority. The mythology that grew around the battle sometimes obscured its historical reality. The turkey shoot nickname, while memorable, suggested casual sport rather than systematic military operations. The actual combat was anything but casual. American pilots executed carefully planned tactics against an opponent they knew was dangerous even when outmatched. Japanese pilots fought with determination and skill against overwhelming disadvantages. The lopsided results reflected systemic differences between the combatants rather than individual performance differences between pilots. Studying the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot today provides insights that extend beyond World War II. The battle demonstrates how technological gaps between opponents can create situations where quantitative comparisons become misleading. It shows how training quality affects combat outcomes in ways that are difficult to quantify but decisive in practice. It illustrates how logistics, seemingly unglamorous, determines what happens when forces actually engage. And it reveals how intelligence advantages multiply the effects of other capabilities. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. It secured the Marianas for American occupation. It opened the path for B-29 raids on Japan. It forced a change in Japanese government and strategy, but perhaps most significantly, it demonstrated to both sides that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan could continue fighting. It would continue fighting for 14 more months, but after June 19th, 1944, that fighting could only delay defeat, not prevent it. When Japanese pilots intercepted F6F Hellcats on the morning of June 19th and discovered they faced 19-to-1 odds, they learned what American industrial might, technological sophistication, and systematic preparation meant in practice. The lesson was brutal, clear, and permanent. The age of Japanese naval aviation superiority that had seemed so dominant in 1941 was over. What remained was only fighting long enough to die with some measure of honor intact. For pilots like Sakio Tsuboi, who understood this reality before most of his countrymen, the rest of the war became an exercise in survival through luck rather than skill. And when August 1945 finally arrived, surrender came not as surprise but as relief. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.